Today's word from the golden chain is, and that golden chain is from Romans 8, 29 and 30, is the word called. Now, many people talk about being called to a job or to a career or to a place, even maybe to a ministry. And all of those ideas are very real. But the calling in Romans 8:30 is related to salvation. It is a part of the process. It is the third link in the golden chain. It is the middle link of the golden chain. Now, when we think of being called, or I might use the word calling in a sense, meaning the same thing, but we often think of calling as someone calling out a name or perhaps a telephone call. And many may remember the days when before caller ID, when you received a phone call and you did not know who was on the other line. Now, caller ID then became a feature that you could pay for so that you could determine whether or not you wanted to answer the phone. And of course, now our cell phones have the number pop up or a name popped up if they're in your address book. But or contact list, as it's called, I guess. But the point being that calling typically means somebody is calling you, they're yelling out for you, they've made a phone call, etc. And you have a choice on whether or not to respond. Well, the call of God is different. The call that is referenced in Romans 8:30 is what theologians refer to as effectual calling. That is, the call is effective. Seemingly, we have no choice, but this kind of goes back to the idea of predestined, which was yesterday's word. But we can know that the calling is effective because of the next word that we'll talk about tomorrow, because the text says, Paul wrote, those he called, those God called, he also justified. Now, the wording here is important. It does not say that God justified most of those he called. The implication is that the wording is that every person that he called, he also justified. So the calling was effectual. The calling was effective. Now, frankly, this idea of an effectual calling leads to different arguments, theological arguments, and some can get very, very heated, but that's not my purpose because, frankly, even after hours of debate, very rarely is any kind of resolution had. And so, although that idea does have relevance to Romans chapter 8, the more important idea for us today, as we think of the golden chain, is that our calling is to make us more like Jesus. And that leads us to Holy Week, because Jesus had a purpose that no one else has ever had, nor could anyone else ever have. Jesus was called to do something that only he could do. Now, I'm using the word as we normally think of called in that fashion, not as Paul did in Romans 8:30. Let me continue that idea, because from before the time that Jesus was born, Jesus was meant to come, he was meant to teach, he was meant to heal, ultimately he was meant to suffer, and he was meant to die. But Jesus was also called in that sense to be raised from the dead. The last part of Jesus' purpose, to suffer, to die, and to be raised, should give us comfort, and this is where the calling that God has put upon us is so real, that we are called because we are to become more like Jesus. That is what the golden chain is referencing, that God wants to conform us to the image of his Son, Romans 8:29. And part of that image is the suffering, go back to Romans 8:17, is the death, go back to Romans 6, and the raising from the dead, which Paul will hint at. He's also hinted at it in other scriptures prior. But if we understand that God has called us to be conformed to the image of Jesus, that is the Son, then we can know that our suffering and even our death is not the end, if indeed we have been called by God. That part of the calling, of our calling, matches what Jesus did up to the point of dying. But if Jesus was called out of the tomb, then so shall we be. For those who follow Jesus, the reason our calling is certain is because of the next step, as I've already said, which took place at the cross, and that next part of the golden chain, being justified, is the focus of tomorrow's video.